podcast, I'll try to tell the story of the earliest civilizations in South and East Asia, and we'll begin in South Asia with a civilization that emerged in the Indus Valley of modern-day Pakistan and India around 5,000 years ago. So, what do we need to know about the Indus Valley civilization? Unlike Egypt and Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley civilization was not discovered until the 1920s, and we now know that a complex civilization flourished between the years 3000 and 2000 BCE, and that the civilization essentially collapsed sometime after 2000 BCE. It was located in modern-day Pakistan and India and covered an area around the size of France, which made it much bigger than both Egypt and Mesopotamia. So far, hundreds of sites have been discovered, with Harappa and Mohenjo-daro being the biggest. And these cities have a lot in common. When we look at them, it's obvious a great deal of urban planning went into building them. The streets, which are all the same width, are laid out in a grid pattern, and the lower class houses were nearly identical. And there's also a complex system of drainage pipe that carried the city's waste away. And just based on the complexity of the design, we can infer that there was a strong, well-organized government in place. Just like in Egypt and Mesopotamia, the economy depended on the flooding of great rivers. And the Indus flooded unpredictably, like the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia. And as in the other early civilizations, farmers relied on the fertile crescent package of wheat, barley, cattle, sheep, goats, that was outlined by Jared Diamond in Guns, Germs, and Steel. And cotton was also extremely important to the economy. In terms of trade, we know from excavations that the Indus Valley civilization traded as far away as Persia and Mesopotamia. So, what was trade like during this time? Now, I say that the Indus Valley civilization traded with Mesopotamia, which is over 1,000 miles away. I don't mean that one merchant traveled the whole distance. Typically, trade goods had to change hands many times before arriving at their final destination. Trade routes were very dangerous. It's not like there were no other people living between the Indus Valley and Mesopotamia. It's more like early civilizations were small islands of innovation surrounded by people who were living in much older ways. And these civilizations produced surpluses, and they were targeted by nomads. So it makes sense, then, that nomads like to raid trade caravans. And merchants, for their part, basically relied on nomads who would be hired security and act as guides for trade caravans. And typically a caravan would only travel a relatively short distance before trading. Okay, so here's the exciting part. Our present knowledge of the Indus Valley civilization is totally incomplete. One of the key reasons is that most of the evidence lies under the water table, and more importantly, we don't understand their writing. And a lot of what we know about Egypt and Mesopotamia comes from written records. Now, the Indus Valley civilization did have writing. They had an alphabet of about 400 symbols, but scholars have been unable to decipher anything. So everything we do know comes from non-written evidence, like excavations of cities and art. Now, up until the 1920s, scholars believed that civilization in South Asia was sparked by the arrival of the Aryans, who were a pastoral people that migrated to Southwest Asia from Central Asia and possibly from Europe. We know now that by the time the Aryans arrived, Harappa had been on the decline for hundreds of years, and when the Aryans arrived, they became the dominant group in the region and mixed with the people already living there and established a racial mix in what is now India. So, the Aryans arrived as herders. They were not as technologically advanced as the earlier Indus Valley civilization, and they had no written language. They did leave behind a collection of hymns, songs, prayers, rituals known as the Vedas, which will be discussed in next week's podcast on belief systems. Farming began in China around the year 7000 BCE along the banks of the Yellow River in northern China and the Yangtze River in southern China, with the first complex civilizations emerging along the banks of the Yellow River around 2000 BCE. The Yellow River gets its name from the large amounts of less which accumulates in the river, and less is a sediment which is rich in nutrients that's ideal for farming. And the Yellow River begins very high in the mountains of Tibet, and as it comes down, the mountains, it picks up this sediment and flows and empties into the Yellow Sea. Now, the Yellow River is a very unpredictable river, so more similar to the rivers in Mesopotamia. And because of this unpredictability, it caused a lot of floods and a lot of damage, and it's been given the nickname China's Sorrow. The staple crops along the banks of the Yellow River in the north were millet, which was native to China, and wheat, which was part of the Fertile Crescent package. And rice, which we often associate with China, required a warmer climate and was grown only in the beginning in southern China along the Yangtze River. Now, in terms of geography, China is isolated by natural barriers, so it has mountains to the southwest, deserts to the west, the Mongolian steppe to the north, and the Pacific Ocean to the east. So it was more isolated than the other early civilizations that we've looked at thus far, and it meant that China was influenced less by outside factors and grew up more distinctively. So the first complex early civilizations in China emerged along the Yellow River, likely out of the need for coordination of large-scale public projects. So the extensive agriculture that they were now practicing required coordinated efforts to clear forests, to build dikes, and in situations where there was a drought, to build reservoirs of water to offset the drought. So what I want to do is just provide a quick overview of some of the earliest dynasties in China and what these dynasties had in common and how they differed from each other. And the history of China up until the 20th century is the history of ruling dynasties. And a dynasty is a family that rules over an extended period of time, with leadership being passed down from generation to generation. And the three earliest dynasties in China are the Shang, the Shang, and the Zhou. So social hierarchy in China was similar to other early civilizations. The ruling elites included the royal family and allied noble families, and these families lived off the surpluses and taxes of the lower classes. And following in the social hierarchy were land-owning aristocrats, who were typically the relatives and allies of the royal family, and they were often appointed to administrative positions, military positions. Beneath the aristocrats, you have a small class of craftsmen, and below them merchants, and then finally peasants and slaves. But unlike the other early civilizations, ancient China did not recognize supreme human-like gods that intervened daily in the lives of citizens. Instead, it was a more abstract understanding of God, and this changed throughout history in China. It was always a more abstract understanding. And as a result, ancient China is the only civilization whose social hierarchy didn't have a large class of priests. Little is known about the Shah, who are considered the first Chinese dynasty, and archaeologists are just beginning to piece together information, and we know very little about them. It's believed that the Shah established the basis for the authoritarian hereditary rule of dynasties, so established a precedent that would last for thousands of years in China. We know much more about the Shang dynasty, mainly because the Shang left some written records for us. And the Shang ruled effectively for 6.5 centuries, and they did so through brute military force. Their weapons were made of bronze, which is made from a combination of copper and tin. Now, bronze was the first metal that humans mastered and began to work with and make tools with. And Mesopotamians discovered bronze around 4000 BCE and began to use it to make weapons and farming equipment. In ancient China, the Shang dynasty made a point of restricting access to tin and copper ores so that they would be the only ones in the region capable of producing bronze weapons and tools. And they used their monopoly on bronze to control the population. Shang kings had a large group of political allies who supported the king in exchange for a share of the agricultural surpluses and access to the copper and tin ores. Chinese writing, like in other early civilizations, was an activity of the elites, and it was mostly used to keep court records. Some of the most interesting Chinese records, however, are found on what are known as oracle bones. Now, the royal court would employ a small number of fortune tellers who would write questions on the bones of oxes or turtles. They would then heat the bones until they cracked, and they would read the cracks to determine meaning. The types of questions that were asked were things like, will there be a good harvest this year? Should I invade our neighbors? And so on. So just having these records lets us know what some of the concerns of the royal family at the time were. From Neolithic times, the Chinese family was the most important cultural institution, and a major theme throughout Chinese history is respect for elders. This is commonly known as the veneration of ancestors. During the Shang period, God was known as Di, and Di was an impersonal, abstract God that wasn't concerned with humans, and humans could not directly communicate with Di. After death, the belief was that the spirit moved into the same realm as Di, and these departed ancestors were able to communicate with Di, and they could intervene with things that happened on Earth. So the belief was that families could prosper only if the dead and the living worked cooperatively together. Now, the most powerful person in the family was the oldest living male, and he presided over ceremonies that honored departed ancestors, with the very real belief that the living needed the help of the dead to survive. The Shang ruled for 6.5 centuries, eventually being replaced by the Zhou dynasty, who came from the west in the valley of the Wei River. The Zhou were initially political allies with the Shang, who supported the Shang in wars against nomadic invaders from the north. So as the story goes, around the year 11,000 BCE, the Shang king became very corrupt and obsessed with women and drinking, and China fell into a period of turmoil. The Zhou took it upon themselves to overthrow the Shang and establish themselves as the new dynasty. Now, the importance of the story is that it's the basis for an aspect of China that was established over 1,000 years BCE and endured well into the 20th century. And that concept is the mandate of heaven. The Zhous replaced the concept of Di with the concept of Tian, which can roughly be translated as heaven. And basically, the principle was that a ruler is heaven's representative on earth, and as long as he rules virtuously, he will have the favor of heaven. But if the ruler becomes corrupt, heaven will strip the mandate of heaven and bring about floods and invasions, creating a period of turmoil and upheaval, ultimately awarding the mandate to a more deserving individual. So, for thousands of years, the various dynasties in China legitimized authoritarian rule by claiming they had the mandate of heaven. The Zhou dynasty lasted for approximately 800 years, but during their rule, China was very fragmented, with many different rulers all vying for power. And eventually China fell into a period of perpetual civil war, known as the Warring States period. And we'll speak of the Warring State period in the coming weeks. So this is the end of episode 2. Thank you for listening.